It was the final evening of the year, when the city dressed itself in borrowed splendor and pretended, for a few glittering hours, that sorrow had been mislaid. Carriages crowded the streets like jeweled beetles, their lamps cutting warm halos through the frost, while music spilled from grand townhouses in promises it could not keep. Inside one such house, beneath chandeliers blazing with ruthless brightness, she stood alone, aware of herself in the way the poor are always aware, by contrast. Her gown, once blue, had faded into a color like remembered skies, carefully mended at the seams and hopelessly outshone by silks that whispered wealth with every step. She kept her gloves on despite the heat, not from modesty but to hide the thinness of her hands, the small betrayals of want no polish could disguise. No one had greeted her upon arrival. No one now marked her stillness by the wall, where mirrors reflected her presence without granting it consequence. She had been invited, certainly, but only in the way charity is extended when refusal would appear crueler than indifference. Across the room, laughter burst and fell like thrown coins, and names of consequence traveled easily between painted lips, never once landing upon her. She recognized the glances that slid past her shoulders, the subtle narrowing of eyes that measured her worth and found it wanting. Years of practice had taught her how to bear such judgments with composure, how to stand as though solitude were a deliberate choice. Yet tonight, the pretense weighed heavier, for the year's ending sharpened every absence, every unspoken fear of what awaited her beyond these doors. When at last she approached the steward to inquire, politely, carefully, whether a place might yet be found for her, he hesitated too long. His eyes flicked over her shoulder, assessing, calculating, and the pause itself delivered the verdict before his soft apology did. There were no tables remaining, he murmured, though she could see empty chairs kept open like promises reserved for worthier guests. Heat rushed to her face, then drained away, leaving a practiced calm that felt dangerously close to breaking. She thanked him anyway, because gratitude was the last coin she possessed, and turned toward the exit with her head held high. Behind her, conversation resumed, softer now, edged with speculation she did not need to hear to understand. She paused once at the threshold, hand on the cold banister, allowing herself a single breath of regret for what might have been. Snow waited beyond the door, clean and indifferent, ready to erase the faint tracks of her presence. It was then, in that fragile interval between endurance and retreat, that the room changed. A hush moved through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable, as if a string had been drawn tight along every spine. She felt it before she understood it, the sudden awareness of attention turning, of weight shifting in the air. Somewhere behind her, a chair scraped softly against marble, and a presence rose that commanded silence without asking for it. She did not yet turn, but her heart answered first, beating with a hope so sudden it frightened her. Tonight, she had expected to vanish unnoticed into the closing year. Instead, the night itself seemed to be calling her name. Whispers stilled, breath caught, and the fragile order of the evening bent around a single, unanticipated act. The steward straightened, startled, and ladies nearest the long table turned as one, fans suspended midair. At the far end of the hall, beneath a chandelier older than most titles present, a man was standing. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in severe black that required no ornament to announce authority. His face, composed and unreadable, belonged to a man accustomed to being obeyed, and more rarely, to choosing mercy. She knew him at once, as everyone did, though they had never been introduced. He was the Duke of Ashcombe, whose name alone could still a room or ruin a reputation. For a heartbeat, his gaze rested not on the glittering company but on the solitary figure near the door. The distance between them felt suddenly charged, as though fate itself had drawn a line and dared them to cross. Her instinct urged her to flee before curiosity hardened into scrutiny, before hope made a fool of her again. But her feet would not move, held fast by the simple, terrible possibility that she had been seen. The Duke did not speak. He did not need to. With emotion both restrained and irrevocable, he lifted his hand and gestured across the room. It was not grand, nor theatrical, yet it cleaved the evening in two. The gesture said only this: "Come." Every eye followed the invisible thread drawn between them, and in that instant, her obscurity ended. She stood at the threshold of disgrace or deliverance, knowing that one step forward would change everything. The music faltered, then ceased entirely, leaving only the sound of her own breath as she turned to face him fully. In his expression there was no pity, no amusement, only a steady regard that suggested intention rather than impulse. The year was ending, the door stood open behind her, and before her waited a choice she had never been permitted. Whether it would crown her with scandal or grant her a future, she could not know, only that refusal would return her to silence. The night seemed to lean forward, listening, as she gathered herself beneath the weight of 100 watching hearts. Somewhere deep within, a fragile defiance stirred, answering the Duke's summons with something like courage. She took a breath that trembled, lifted her chin, and prepared to step into a story she had never dared imagine. Before she moved, before fate could be sealed, the Duke's hand remained outstretched, waiting, patient, as though he had all the time in the world. And in that pause, suspended between winter and hope, her forgotten life held its breath at last. The moment she obeyed the silent summons, stepping forward as though drawn by some unseen gravity, the air itself seemed to bend around her. Each footfall upon the polished marble echoed like a heartbeat, measured, hesitant, yet resolute. Guests turned in unison, some in surprise, others in thinly veiled disapproval, for no one in Ashcombe society had ever seen the Duke extend such attention to a girl of her station. She felt their gazes as knives, and yet the warmth of his regard offered a shield she had not dared hope to find. The Duke's chair was pulled out for her with a fluid motion, practiced yet intimate, as though the action carried a language of its own. She lowered herself onto the velvet seat, aware of the entire room constricting around her presence. The murmur of conversation faltered, and for an instant, time itself seemed suspended between the chandeliers and the winter shadows. Her gloves felt tight upon her hands, her pulse rattling against each seam, but she held her posture with the care of a woman who had survived countless indignities. He gestured subtly to the steward, who poured wine with hands that trembled slightly under the weight of the audience's scrutiny. The ruby liquid gleamed like captured fire in the crystal glass, and when it was set before her, she felt as if a secret had been entrusted to her alone. She dared a glance at the Duke, expecting indifference, perhaps a hint of amusement at her shock, but instead found eyes that were steady, deliberate, and unmistakably intent. "You may drink if it pleases you," he said, his voice calm yet commanding, a low timbre that vibrated with authority and something else, curiosity, perhaps, or faint approval. His words were simple, almost perfunctory, yet weighted with implication, as if he were not merely offering wine but acknowledging her existence in a way the world had long denied. She inclined her head, careful not to spill even a single drop, and sipped. The taste was bitter, fortified, but she smiled faintly, acknowledging the gesture without surrendering herself entirely to it. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, and in that silence, she realized how precarious her position had become. To accept him meant to defy custom, yet to refuse would brand her invisible once more. Whispers began anew, sliding through the ballroom like silk ribbons. The audacity of the Duke, the impropriety of allowing such a girl a seat of consequence, the questions of motive that could unravel reputations faster than the sharpest gossip. She felt the sting, though her face betrayed nothing. She had learned to contain the tremor of fear beneath a calm exterior, to transform it into measured grace. Yet tonight, every glance seemed a spotlight, every whisper a blade. The Duke observed her with unwavering attention. There was no condescension in his expression, only a cool, deliberate curiosity that unsettled her more than any insult. He leaned slightly forward, resting one gloved hand upon the table. "Do you find the evening agreeable?" he asked, voice quiet yet resonant, carrying a weight that drew her in. The question was polite, formal, and yet it bristled with hidden meaning, as though the room and its judgment mattered little beside the truth he sought from her alone. She hesitated, searching for the right words, for a reply that could honor both herself and the subtle invitation he extended. "It is tolerable," she murmured, the corners of her mouth lifting ever so slightly. Her tone was respectful, careful, yet threaded with the faintest defiance, an acknowledgment that she would not be cowed by circumstance or expectation. The Duke's eyes crinkled with the barest hint of amusement, though his posture remained impeccably restrained. "Tolerable," he repeated, softly, as if tasting the word upon his tongue. A modest appraisal for a night that could offer far more, were one to accept it. His gaze lingered, and in that hold of attention, she felt the stirrings of something both dangerous and exhilarating, a permission to hope, and perhaps to dream, despite every rule society had imposed upon her. As the minutes stretched, small tokens of attention appeared, A carefully placed napkin folded in delicate artistry, a subtle arrangement of flowers at her side, the nearest servant leaning slightly to anticipate her needs before they were spoken. Each act was minor, almost imperceptible, yet in their accumulation, they formed a shield against the judgmental eyes pressing from all directions. Every gesture whispered a quiet rebellion against the rigid hierarchy of wealth and birth, a defiance so understated it seemed invisible to all but the two who truly mattered. Still, scandal simmered beneath the surface. Conversations resumed in hushed, pointed tones. Eyes darted to her as if she were an experiment under observation. "Why would the Duke," one lady murmured to another, "allow such familiarity?" The words were measured, but their venom was unmistakable. Each whispered question threatened to reduce her to the very invisibility she had feared, yet simultaneously underscored the unprecedented nature of her new position at the table. And then came the first tangible gift, a small, silver trinket, left upon the table beside her glass. It was simple, elegant, and carried no inscription, yet its meaning was unambiguous. To accept it was to acknowledge the Duke's attention, to accept the rules he bent for her alone, to enter a delicate dance of society and secrecy. She lifted it cautiously, tracing its edges with gloved fingers, feeling the weight of both promise and peril. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she was no longer merely tolerated, that the Duke's gesture could carry intention beyond pity or charity. Yet the room reminded her, with every glance and whispered conjecture, that society's judgment was swift, unyielding, and merciless. To exist in his attention was to flirt with ruin as easily as with exhilaration. The Duke spoke again, quietly, his words reaching her as though drawn through a separate air, apart from the clamor and intrigue. "You must forgive me if I appear forward," he said, "but I have always found those overlooked by the world to be most deserving of recognition." His tone was carefully controlled, yet beneath it lay something undeniable, conviction. He did not flinch, did not apologize for bending the rules. He stated only the truth as he saw it, and in that statement, he invited her to see herself differently as well. She nodded, understanding that her acceptance of this attention would alter everything. She felt a swell of something unfamiliar and dangerous. Courage, yes, but mingled with fear of exposure, of rumor, of misjudgment. And yet she could not resist the pull, could not deny the gravity of the moment. A murmur ran through the room, a subtle shift in the tide of eyes and opinions. Some leaned forward with scandal in their expression, others recoiled with envy. She recognized that this night would not be forgotten, by anyone. Her position was no longer one of invisibility. She had entered the delicate limelight, a spotlight she had neither sought nor yet fully understood. He raised his glass, just enough for her to see the movement, and she returned the gesture, hands trembling only slightly. That single acknowledgment was a silent pact, a promise unspoken, a challenge accepted. The room seemed to hold its breath once more, aware that boundaries had been crossed, that rules had been bent, and that something extraordinary had begun in the space between them. Outside, winter pressed against the tall windows, snow falling in silent, indifferent perfection. Inside, warmth, light, and human judgment pressed equally upon her, but she had stepped into the arena nonetheless. Scandal, attention, and possibility swirled together, a delicate storm she had not invited but could not now avoid. And as the Duke inclined his head ever so slightly, a subtle smile brushing the corner of his lips, she understood fully that the night had shifted irrevocably. What had begun as an evening of dismissal and shame now bore the seeds of fascination and danger, of power and desire, of a connection that society could neither contain nor comprehend. She was no longer merely forgotten. She was seen. And yet, as she raised her eyes to meet his again, the faintest tremor of uncertainty whispered, what did he truly intend, and would she be ready to follow where his gaze might lead? The doors closed behind them with a muted click, and the sounds of the ballroom, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the whispered speculations, faded into the distance like a world receding beneath water. They entered a corridor lined with dark-paneled walls, the soft glow of wall sconces casting gold upon polished wood. The air smelled of cedar and wax, of warmth that had been tended with care, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself to breathe without the suffocating weight of the gaze that had followed her from the doorway. The Duke led her to a small conservatory, a hidden space where firelight and shadow intertwined. The tall windows framed the night outside, a quilt of snow and gaslight spilling across the frozen streets. He drew aside a curtain, allowing the moon to fall upon her like a benediction, and in that simple gesture, the solitude of the moment wrapped around them like a cloak. She could hear her own pulse, steady yet tremulous, echoing in rhythm with the quiet crackle of the fire. For a heartbeat, they stood there, wordless, the distance between them charged with 1,000 unspoken questions. The Duke's expression was composed, yet his eyes betrayed the faintest flicker of curiosity, of attention, of something more dangerous than courtesy. She found herself caught in that gaze, as though he could read the history she had carried into the room, the nights of hunger, the cold rooms, the endless weight of being overlooked. He spoke first, softly, as though testing the limits of intimacy. "You are not like the others," he said. His tone carried no flattery, only truth, and the simplicity of it cut through the layers of restraint she had draped about herself. "I have observed you for some time, though it was not my place to interfere. Yet tonight, it seems impossible not to notice what the world has chosen to ignore." She looked down, her gloved hands clenching briefly. Her voice emerged, careful, cautious. "The world rarely notices what it ought to. It prefers embellishments and wealth, the appearances of grace rather than its substance. I have little to offer, save the effort of being present." Her words were precise, controlled, yet carried the tremor of vulnerability she dared not erase. He stepped closer, the firelight revealing the angles of his face, the slight tension in his jaw, the measure of a man accustomed to control yet capable of yielding in rare, deliberate ways. "You underestimate yourself," he said quietly, almost to himself, though each syllable struck her with clarity. "Strength, perseverance, dignity. These are rarities far more precious than diamonds, and rarer still in those who are overlooked." She dared to lift her eyes. In them, she saw no judgment, no condescension, only a calm scrutiny that demanded honesty without forcing confession. "I am unremarkable," she murmured. "Invisible, even when I wish to be seen. The world allows me to exist, but never to matter." The Duke inclined his head, the faintest shadow of a smile brushing his lips. "Invisible, perhaps," he acknowledged, "but never unnoticed by those who know where to look. You possess a quiet fire, a resilience that can withstand much the world casts in your path. Few recognize it, yet it commands attention all the same." Her chest tightened, caught between pride and disbelief. It was one thing to endure the cold indifference of society, another to have it acknowledged by a man of power, a man whose presence alone bent the rules of propriety. "And yet," she whispered, "to be noticed brings its own peril. To accept attention is to invite scrutiny, suspicion, and, perhaps, scandal." He regarded her in silence, the flickering firelight reflected in his eyes. "And yet, would you rather remain unnoticed, your life weighed in the scales of mediocrity, or risk consequence for the chance of recognition that might redeem it?" His question was not rhetorical. It carried the gravity of choice, of consequence, and of possibility. Her gaze fell to the floor, tracing the pattern of the tiles as if seeking a map of safe passage. I do not know if I am brave enough," she admitted. The confession, softly spoken, sounded like a key turning in a lock, a small liberation of truth she had guarded fiercely. "I fear the world, and the judgments it lays upon those who step beyond the bounds of expectation." He extended his hand then, not with command, but with deliberate patience. The offer was simple, yet charged with meaning, an invitation to trust, to step forward, to accept the space he had carved out for her in a world that had long denied her both notice and protection. Her fingers hovered above his, trembling, the firelight catching the tips of her gloves as though time itself paused to witness the choice she faced. "Do you trust me?" he asked, voice low, carrying both authority and a fragile vulnerability rarely permitted in a man of his stature. The question was not merely of hand-holding or proximity, but of hearts, of the quiet risk that accompanies surrendering to another's intent. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, yet the tremor in her hand steadied as she allowed herself the smallest motion, her fingers brushing against his. The contact was electric yet understated, a declaration in silence that she would meet him halfway across the chasm of expectation and fear. The conservatory seemed to shrink around them, each shadow, each reflection, lending intimacy to the moment. She dared to look at him fully, studying the contours of his expression, the gentle tension in his stance, the way he had carefully bent a world that had never offered mercy on her behalf. "Tonight," he continued, "I disregard propriety. Not for whim, nor for show, but because I recognize something rare in you, and it would be a greater wrong to ignore it than to invite censure." His words were precise, restrained, yet their impact was undeniable. In their honesty lay an unspoken promise, a world bending to the will of two hearts willing to see beyond its rigid laws. She felt a warmth that was neither the fire nor the wine, but something more intimate, a fragile ember of hope nurtured by acknowledgment. "I have never been allowed such recognition," she whispered, "and it frightens me as much as it comforts." He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the truth in her confession. "Then perhaps fear is the proper companion of hope," he said, "for those who dare step beyond invisibility must learn to endure both judgment and exhilaration." A subtle tension filled the room, the air between them alive with expectation. Every detail mattered. The flicker of the fire, the sheen of her gown, the measured tilt of his hand, the hush of the night pressing through the glass panes. It was a moment poised delicately on the edge of scandal and intimacy, where every word, every gesture, carried the weight of consequences yet unseen. She took another, deeper breath, steadying herself, aware that in yielding to this connection she risked both reputation and heart. And yet, for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future not dictated by indifference, a life touched by attention not born of obligation but of deliberate regard. He watched her, unflinching, as if offering patience both rare and profound. "We are both bound by circumstance," he said quietly. "Yet here, in this moment, we may write our own measure of propriety, one small act at a time." Her hand remained in his, warm and steady against her own racing pulse. She lifted her eyes to meet his fully, seeing not just a patron nor a distant observer, but a man willing to defy expectation, willing to create space where none had existed before. And in that gaze, the quiet acknowledgment of her own courage stirred within her. She realized, with a thrill she could scarcely name, that the night had shifted irrevocably. What had begun as a step into the unknown now held the fragile promise of intimacy, revelation, and a choice that might redefine her life entirely. Yet outside the conservatory, the world waited, relentless in its scrutiny and readiness to judge. The firelight painted the room in gold, and for a fleeting moment, she understood that the line between safety and peril, discretion and scandal, was a single step, and that each choice from this night forward would carry its own weight, measured in whispers and consequences that had yet to arrive. And as the Duke's hand tightened, ever so slightly, around hers, the faintest edge of uncertainty lingered. What truths would the night uncover, and would courage alone suffice to navigate the perilous path now set before them? The ballroom had changed while they were absent, though the chandeliers still gleamed and the polished floors reflected every flicker of candlelight as if nothing had altered. Yet the air felt different now, taut with anticipation, as if the very walls had sensed the private confessions that had unfolded in the conservatory. Guests lingered near tables, glasses held loosely in trembling hands, whispers curling around the gilded columns like smoke from a distant hearth. She returned with him, hand lightly brushing his sleeve, each step a measured defiance of the expectations that sought to bind her. Eyes followed her as though she were a rare creature glimpsed only in legend, a contradiction to the careful order of Ashcombe society. The whispers rose and fell, some curious, some scandalized, others plainly incredulous. She could feel the judgment, keen and precise, but there was also something new, a tension that demanded attention rather than derision. The Duke, for his part, walked beside her with that composed authority which had first caught her in its quiet gravity, a silent reassurance that whatever awaited them, it would be met as one. At the long table where she had once been denied a place, the chatter halted. Gentlemen's eyebrows rose, fans flicked midair, and matronly glances sharpened. Yet he did not falter, nor did he hesitate in his purpose. The Duke raised his head, voice carrying across the still air with that calm precision which always drew focus. "Ladies, gentlemen," he said, each syllable deliberate, resonant, "I ask you to permit a deviation from propriety this evening, for what is life if we do not honor truth where it presents itself?" Her breath caught in her throat. Truth here, in a room ruled by appearances and silent competition, was a dangerous thing. Yet she felt no fear in his words, only the assurance that he had chosen to confront the scrutiny of all present for the sake of what he considered just. It was not spectacle, it was declaration. She dared to lift her gaze, meeting his fully, noting the faint line of determination upon his brow. "You mean to shield me?" she whispered, though the words scarcely carried above the hush. He inclined his head slightly, eyes steady upon hers, conveying that the choice was his to make, and he had chosen, against expectation, to honor her presence above custom, above judgment, above all else. "Miss Ashford," he continued, his tone firm yet measured, carrying the weight of authority without arrogance, "the evening has been long, and I have observed enough to know that your quiet dignity surpasses the pretenses celebrated by this company. I will not permit the constraints of custom to render your virtue invisible. Join me, not as a figure of charity, but as one whose worth is self-evident." A ripple moved through the gathered company. Murmurs rose. Questions formed in the mouths of those who dared to speak. Yet she remained poised, the firelight glinting in her eyes, tracing the faint lines of tension in her face. She understood that acceptance of this attention, here and now, would be seen by society as both audacious and improper. Yet refusal would be to deny herself, to shrink into a shadow she no longer wished to inhabit. Her lips parted slightly, the words forming carefully, measured, yet carrying an unspoken depth of gratitude and courage. "Your acknowledgment honors me," she murmured, voice steady despite the quickening of her heart. "I accept, not for spectacle, but for the truth you have recognized." The Duke's expression softened ever so slightly, the first trace of warmth illuminating the austerity of his features. "Then let all witnesses bear that truth," he said, voice low but carrying across the hall. "For it is not mine to bestow favor lightly, nor yours to receive with hesitation. You are acknowledged, Miss Ashford, as you deserve." A sudden hush fell again, the murmurs silenced by the gravity of his words. Guests glanced at one another, uncertain how to respond to a man who defied convention so resolutely. Some eyes blazed with envy, others narrowed with disapproval, yet she could feel in her chest a thrilling liberation. She was no longer merely tolerated. She had been chosen, publicly, deliberately, and irrevocably. A servant approached to offer the wine again, but neither moved. The Duke's focus remained entirely upon her, and in that gaze, she felt the embers of intimacy that had begun in the quiet of the conservatory flare with a new intensity. She realized, in a way both exhilarating and frightening, that this recognition carried consequences as tangible as any scandal whispered in shadowed corridors. And yet she did not falter. She allowed herself to drink in the moment, to inhale the full measure of attention, protection, and dangerous hope. "Do you comprehend," he asked softly, leaning nearer so only she might hear, "that what you accept here is more than a place at my table? It is an acknowledgment that the world need not dictate your worth, nor shall it deny what it has so long overlooked." She nodded, her throat tight, the firelight reflecting in her eyes like trapped stars. "I understand," she replied, barely above a whisper, yet strong enough to carry the weight of conviction. "And I accept the risk, knowing it may bring both scandal and scrutiny. I will not flee from the honor you have afforded me." His hand rested lightly on the back of her chair, an assertion of both presence and protection. Every detail of the room seemed heightened. The glint of crystal, the soft murmur of the fire, the distant chime of a bell marking the late hour. The world outside could judge, could speculate, but here, in this confluence of attention and choice, they existed in a space carved from courage and deliberate intent. The Duke's voice, low and measured, continued, drawing her attention fully. "Tonight, propriety yields to acknowledgment, and acknowledgment to truth. You have walked with grace through scrutiny and hesitation alike. Know that I respect this, as well as the strength that brought you here despite what others would say." Her chest swelled with a mix of fear and elation. She had anticipated being invisible, overlooked, and dismissed, yet now she stood in the heart of a moment that defied expectation, that would be remembered by some with admiration, by others with envy. She realized that courage was not absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it, and she had chosen to act. Somewhere in the distance, a candle flickered and guttered, casting fleeting shadows across the crowd, as though the room itself were acknowledging the shift. The whispers resumed, faint, tentative, but they could no longer define her. She had stepped forward, and the Duke had honored that step with a declaration that no custom could undo. He inclined his head once, his gaze steady and unwavering, the faintest trace of warmth returning to his austere features. "Miss Ashford, the night bears witness, and so shall history, if it chooses to remember these moments of defiance and recognition. You are acknowledged not as an ornament, but as a woman of merit. A thrill ran through her, a current that she could neither name nor resist, as the consequences of this acknowledgment settled around her shoulders like a mantle both heavy and glorious. The applause that followed was quiet, polite, and measured, yet in its restraint lay acknowledgment. Society had been confronted, and she had emerged visible. She allowed herself a small exhale, a subtle acknowledgment of the courage it had taken to stand, to accept, to meet the gaze of a man who could have chosen anyone else yet chose her. And in that breath, the weight of fear lightened, replaced by a fragile hope that perhaps recognition and respect could coexist with scandal, that daring to be seen might carry its own reward. Yet the evening was not without peril. Outside the sanctuary of the ballroom, eyes continued to watch, to whisper, to measure and judge. Her courage had altered her path, yes, but it had not absolved her of consequence. And still, as the Duke's hand rested lightly on her chair and the warmth of his presence anchored her, she understood that the night had shifted irrevocably, that she had been seen, chosen, and acknowledged in a manner both perilous and exhilarating. And as the distant clock struck again, marking the progression of hours and the turn of a year, she felt the faintest tremor of anticipation. What would the world demand next, and would the courage she had summoned tonight be enough to meet it? The first light of the new year crept softly over the city, brushing the frost-laden streets with silver and gold. Snow clung to window panes and iron railings, muffling the distant clatter of carriages and the muted chatter of those who lingered into the dawn. The ballroom, once filled with music and judgment, lay empty now, its polished floors reflecting the fragile glow of a single candle left flickering on a table. She stood near the tall windows, wrapped in a cloak that carried both warmth and the scent of cedar, gazing outward at the quiet streets and imagining what the hours ahead might bring. Behind her, he moved with the measured calm of a man accustomed to control, yet tonight even his poise carried a subtle tension. The Duke of Ashcombe, formidable in reputation and presence, was both anchor and mystery, his gaze never leaving her as though to ensure that the fragile courage she had summoned would not falter now, in this final moment before the year's promise gave way to reality. She turned slowly to face him, the candlelight catching the shadows beneath her eyes, the traces of fear and exhilaration mingling there in equal measure. "It feels different now," she said, voice soft yet steady, carrying the weight of all she had endured, the hunger, the indifference, the quiet erasures of a life she had once imagined invisible. "To be seen, truly seen. It is more terrifying than I anticipated." He inclined his head slightly, the faintest curve of a smile breaking the austerity of his features. "To be recognized for what one truly is," he said, voice low and resonant, "has always been a dangerous gift, yet no less necessary for those who possess it. You have stepped into the world not as a shadow, but as a woman who commands attention by merit, courage, and quiet dignity. That is not given lightly." Her chest tightened. Recognition, yes, but at what cost? She had already felt the piercing sting of judgment, the whispers of scandal that would follow her long after this night. And yet, standing here, in the soft dawn of a year renewed, she felt a warmth that had little to do with fire or cloak, a warmth born of choice, of acknowledgment, of the rare and terrifying possibility of love. He stepped closer, careful, deliberate, every motion measured yet unyielding in its intent. "Tonight," he continued, "I declare not only what you are, but what you shall be. I will not permit the world to judge your worth by its petty rules. Miss Ashford, if you will accept it, you shall take a new name, a name born not of poverty, nor of forgotten circumstance, but of promise and intention." Her fingers trembled slightly at the edges of her cloak, the weight of anticipation pressing upon her chest. "A new name," she whispered. The words sounded fragile in the still air, as if the very syllables carried both hope and risk. I do not know if I deserve such a gift." "Deserve?" he echoed softly, his gaze firm yet unyielding. "It is not a question of merit, nor of favor bestowed lightly. It is a recognition of courage, endurance, and truth. You have faced judgment, embarrassment, and invisibility with composure, yet you have allowed yourself, despite fear, to be seen. That alone warrants acknowledgment. That alone permits this act." She swallowed, a lump forming as a tide of emotion rose within her. Recognition. Acceptance. Permission to exist fully in a world that had long denied her both attention and agency. "Then, what must I do?" she asked, voice barely above a breath, fragile as snow yet carrying a tremor of readiness. He extended his hand, not as command, but as invitation. "Take it, and with it the life you have earned, the name you have yet to claim, and the choice to step fully into the future." The room seemed to still around them, the candlelight flickering as though holding its breath, the silence amplifying the gravity of the moment. Her hand rose, trembling, and brushed against his. The contact was electric yet understated, a conduit of understanding, trust, and unspoken promise. She let her fingers rest lightly against his, feeling in that connection both safety and exhilaration, the dangerous thrill of a choice made in defiance of expectation. "Then it shall be so," he said, voice low, deliberate, reverent in its cadence. "From this moment forward, the world shall know you not as one overlooked, but as a woman chosen, recognized, and honored. Your name shall carry not only your history, but the intention of this declaration, and the promise of every possibility yet to come." Tears rose unbidden to her eyes, though she did not hasten to brush them away. The emotion was not shame, nor fear, but an acknowledgment of every struggle, every invisible night endured, every moment she had endured being unnoticed and dismissed. It was a recognition of self, mirrored and affirmed by the one man who had dared to defy custom for the sake of truth. He watched her carefully, reading the subtle changes upon her face, the trembling of hands, the light in her eyes. "Do you accept this fully?" he asked, soft yet commanding in its gravity. "Not for display, not for approval, but as the truth of your existence?" Her lips curved into a faint, trembling smile, fragile yet undeniable. "I accept," she whispered. "I accept it all. The risk, the attention, the consequences, and I accept you." A subtle, almost imperceptible shift passed between them, as though the air itself had changed, and in that moment, the past, every slight, every hardship, every humiliation, was cast aside like snow swept from a threshold. She felt herself stepping into a life not dictated by the world, but by choice, courage, and acknowledgement. The Duke inclined his head once more, offering a single, deliberate gesture toward the room, as if signaling that the declaration had been made and the moment preserved. He was steady, controlled, yet she could sense the faintest tremor of emotion beneath the surface, a rare human vulnerability that matched her own. Outside, the city stirred with the first sounds of the year, bells ringing faintly, carriage wheels crunching through fresh snow, the promise of new beginnings carried on cold winds. Within the ballroom, the candlelight danced across crystal, gilded frames, and polished floors, reflecting both the grandeur of society and the intimate triumph of two hearts claiming recognition against expectation. Her cloak fell lightly from her shoulders, discarded like the final weight of doubt and invisibility. She stood taller now, aware of the eyes upon her, yet no longer fearful of them. The whispers of gossip would follow, the judgment of society would linger, but they could not diminish the fact that she had been seen, chosen, and honored in a way that mattered beyond reputation or rumor. The Duke extended his arm, a quiet, deliberate invitation. She took it, allowing herself to lean into the solidity of his presence, the warmth of protection, and the subtle, thrilling weight of possibility. Every step forward was a claim, a movement into a life reshaped by courage, acknowledgement, and the fragile promise of love. As they reached the doorway to the waiting carriage, the snow falling softly beyond the iron gates, she realized fully that the night had transformed irrevocably. She was no longer the forgotten girl of New Year's Eve. She was a woman recognized, honored, and chosen, bearing a name yet to be spoken, and a life yet to be written. The carriage door closed with a soft click, enclosing them in warmth and quiet, the flickering gaslight outside casting fleeting shadows across the snow. And in that intimate silence, as the horses stirred and the city awoke around them, she understood the truth, that courage had brought her this far, acknowledgement had given her presence weight, and choice had made her truly alive. Yet even as the city slept and the dawn of the new year broke fully over the streets of Ashcombe, a single question lingered between them, unspoken but undeniable. The world would watch, the whispers would come, and the path ahead was fraught with both promise and peril. Could courage and love endure amidst scrutiny, expectation, and the relentless gaze of society? She felt his hand tighten slightly, a reassuring pressure, and in that touch, the answer was both simple and complex. They would face it together. And so, as the first bell tolled for the new year, echoing through streets white with snow, the forgotten girl had become someone seen, chosen, and named, not by wealth, nor by station, but by courage, truth, and the deliberate defiance of love that dared to reshape a life entirely. The night ended, yes, but the story, her story, had only just begun.